Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Christopher Bedford, and joining me today is Tucker Carlson, host of Tucker Carlson Tonight, which this week broke the record for most watched cable news show ever. Thank you so much for being here with us, Tucker.
Are you kidding? It's my honor.
So your show has become the most watched over the past quarter, especially because you're saying something that no one else is saying. You're calling out the elites of both parties, Democrats and Republicans. You're calling out Washington think tanks. You're calling out the local mayors and attorneys general and prosecutors all over the country for failing to do their job in the face of the mob. You're going forward like someone who thinks that maybe television is a fleeting thing, and you're pouring your entire heart and soul into it. What about this moment has drawn you to it, and what you've been offering that you think is drawing in such record numbers of viewers who are watching?
Well, you know me well. I do think television is a fleeting thing. I think life is a fleeting thing. I've been meditating for some reason, I don't know why, on something of all people Conan O'Brien once said. I'm not a Conan O'Brien fan, but he said something that has never left me, which is, in the end, all graves go unvisited. I think that every day. So, I mean, that kind of centers you in reality. It's like staring at the night sky and you begin to suspect that maybe you're not the center of the universe. So, yeah, I mean, and when we just lost a mutual friend of ours this week. So there are reminders all around us that things change fast and unexpectedly, and you move from one position to another, and then you're done. And so my feeling based on that is that you shouldn't wait to say what you think is true. You should say it now. And that's not hard in this moment because the stakes are so clearly high, the highest they've been in my lifetime. I mean, part of the problem with journalism, and particularly television, is that it torques up the emotional intensity to the point where you lose perspective and you can become paranoid or overwrought. And you really need to, that's why I fly fish and try and spend time with my wife and kids. So I keep asking myself every day, am I losing perspective? Am I making more of this than I ought to be? In 15 years, will we all recognize that this was an important moment, a pivotal moment? And I think the answer is there really is a lot going on now. There is a revolution in progress. I can't stop it. I'm just a talk show host, but I can certainly say what I think about it and encourage other people to do the same. I mean, again, this is a bias that's inherent to my business, but I think that change begins always when you describe what's happening. Words are the seeds of action. And I'm just so struck by how few people have articulated what's going on. And it's not as if they don't understand it. They do. They're just too afraid. And I find that contemptible. I'm not particularly brave. I've never served in the military. I wouldn't want to. You know, I'd be afraid. So it's not like I'm some particularly courageous person. I'm not. It's just that so many people who should be brave are fleeing the scene. And that just enrages me. I mean, it really is like, you know, watching absentee fathers drink during the day, and you keep thinking, well, where are your children? You know, where's your wife? Like, why aren't you doing your duty? How did you abandon them and continue to live with yourself? That's what I think of our leaders right now. Almost all of them. You know what I mean? Like, we had a home invasion. You were the only one who could operate the shotgun, and you were in the bar and turned your cell phone off. You know, and the kids got beaten up and mom got raped and they burned the house down, you know, because you left. You were supposed to protect us. You know, that may sound melodramatic, but that's actually how I feel about it.
And then in the 70s, we saw this. In the late 60s, we saw this kind of violence in the United States and attempts to attack everything we stand for and occupy campuses. You talked about it out in California with the university president. But back then also in the 60s and 70s, we had a Democratic Party that had Jefferson dinners and would hand out copies of the Constitution. The Republican Party that had Lincoln dinners handed out copies of the Constitution. Democratic mayors of major cities like Chicago who would not hesitate to use force to disperse a violent mob. And Washington was respected. Today, when Washington's torn down, what struck me, and we wrote about it at the Federalist, was how reminiscent it was of the revolution in China, when Mao in the Cultural Revolution had Confucius's entire family and clan's graves dug up and desecrated and robbed and destroyed. This is essentially their religion for 1,000 years. And it let the whole people of China know that if this can happen to Confucius, we can do this to Confucius. So we can do this to you or anyone we want.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's the point. And it's funny you mentioned the turmoil of 50 years ago, because I was just reading about it. My father was a reporter in San Francisco from 1963 until the mid-'70s for ABC News. So he was there for all of that, right in the center of where it was happening. And he kept detailed notes, and they're all in bound books, and they happen to be in our barn in Maine. And literally an hour ago, I was sitting at the kitchen table there having a cup of coffee reading one of his notebooks from the winter of 1968. And he covered a riot at San Francisco State that later became famous because the president of the university, S.I. Hayakawa, stood up to the rioters and was rewarded for it. He was later elected senator from California. But the point is, reading these stories, it's almost, I mean, it's almost bewildering how closely the rhetoric tracks to what we're hearing now. The difference, and this leaps off of every page, is that the people in charge, by and large, were not for it. I mean, you had, the so-called artistic creative community, you had Hollywood, book publishing, journalism. I mean, they were all sort of faintly for it, in some cases very for it. But the people who ran American businesses were not for it at all. The head of General Motors was not cheering on the riots. And that just comes through in reading about it. Now, the most powerful people in America, literally the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, is funding this. Jeff Bezos is funding the riots. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, which is cheering on the rioters, helping the rioters think of new things to destroy. He is not simply an accomplice. He's a driver of this chaos and violence. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? Why would people who seem to be so deeply vested in a society work to destroy that society? And it's actually a question, and I don't fully understand the answer, but it's something worth ruminating on. Even more striking to me is that nobody says this. This is, a kind of classic revolution consists of people who believe they are oppressed rebelling against the class above them, right? I want what you have, therefore I'm going to rise up and take it. That's how we understand revolution. This is the first revolution I've ever heard of that's aimed downward. I mean, this is an attempt by the most privileged people in our society to crush and humiliate the least privileged in our society. And again, you have to wonder why. There's something really ominous about that. There's something really, in addition to, how sinister it is and how just immoral what they've done is, it suggests a level of kind of bad sportsmanship that I can't even process. Do you know what I mean? Like, the middle of the country is dying. The middle class is dying. The American middle class has seen, for the first time in modern history, has seen its life expectancy decline, mostly thanks to fentanyl, but there are other factors too. So these are the people who have the least, who are in the worst shape, and yet they are the explicit target of the rage of the rioters, who really are the ruling class. I don't understand that. Why would you attack the weakest in your society? It's grotesque. It's contemptible. I mean, there's something in every person that kind of identifies with the classic revolutionary model. I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm going to go free the prisoners from the Bastille. I mean, even if you don't support the French Revolution, you understand that impulse. right? We're overthrowing the king. I get it. Even monarchists understand why people want to overthrow kings. I don't think normal people could begin to understand why you would want to degrade and hurt people who are already dying.
Now, what strikes me about all of this is going back to the founding of the United States is something that conservative movement's been trying to do for decades now. They raise money off of it. They release pamphlets on it. They hold seminars on it. They organize huge groups of people all across the country to support their work, and they're about as wealthy as they've ever been. They're all over Washington, D.C. One has the largest campus of any private landowner in all of Capitol Hill, the Heritage Foundation, which you've gone after. And today, we've seen such a switch. I just pulled up a fundraising letter from the Cato Institute, which is founded on returning to the Constitution, returning to America's heritage of, quote, individual liberty, free markets, and constitutionally limited government. And their think tank down on Massachusetts Avenue was boarded up against rioters, and their scholars are tweeting at the rioters that they're on their side. They're not sure why they're being targeted at all. Heritage Foundation, which you've criticized in your show, is they have a new campaign. They're preaching to all the different conservative groups around Washington to get people to send in video messages of why they're proud to be an American, and to put yard signs in their front lawn that says they're proud to be an American. It's something that people should do, and it's nice to see, but it doesn't sync up quite with the largest private landowner on Capitol Hill, which stands for the Constitution and the founding, and is worth this much. It's among the most powerful voices in the room. What hope do conservatives or people who are afraid, or people of all different political ideologies who are afraid of this mob, have in these powerful institutions here in D.C., or is D.C. just irrelevant now?
Well, I mean, it depends upon whether the question refers to the short term or the long term. Long term, this is a blessing because institutional conservatism has been revealed for all time to be utterly fatuous and corrupt, pointless, in fact, worse than pointless, hilariously, ironically misguided. I mean, the Heritage Foundation, where I worked, by the way, my first job was at their magazine, Policy Review, 30 years ago. And
for Cato for a little bit.
And then I never got paid by Cato, but I was friends with the head of Cato, a guy called Ed Crane, who was a good guy. I still like Ed Crane. And he gave me the title of visiting scholar or something. I'm not a scholar. But anyway, the point is, it's ridiculous. I mean, anyone who's lived in Washington knows this already. Probably the majority of conservatives in Washington work for one of these things. They all preach smaller government. They all grow, quicker than any tumor, themselves. The whole thing is ridiculous. But what we found out when the chaos began, when things actually began to fall apart, was that not only were they not able to defend us, but they weren't even interested. I mean, the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kay Cole James, God knows what she makes, her first instinct when people started burning Wendy's and beating up bystanders in the street, literally rioting, was to write a piece in USA Today attacking the United States as racist. And not just superficially racist, but racist to its core, and attacking conservatives as racist. So it turns out that the president of the largest conservative think tank is on the side of Black Lives Matter. So what does that tell you? It tells you that there's a profound misalignment between conservatives and the people who supposedly represent them, so profound that it just can't continue. I mean, there's no point to having the Heritage Foundation or Cato or AEI. I mean, all of these places are not just a joke, but they're worse than that. They're an abomination. And actually, if you take 3 steps back, we should have recognized this. I mean, I think most of us did recognize this, but it didn't seem to matter at the time. But places like the Heritage Foundation exist, they say, in order to come up with conservative ideas and craft conservative legislation. Obviously, they failed in the latter. But the macro point is we already have conservative ideas. Let's just stick with the Bill of Rights. How's that? So essentially, we don't need a conservative foundation like the Heritage Foundation. What we need is a large conservative ACLU. We need a bodyguard. What's the goal? The goal is to be able to live in the country if you dissent from Apple's view of the world or Jeff Bezos' view of the world. You just want to live the life that you lived 15 years ago. I mean, I'm not talking about, antebellum America. I'm talking about, 2005 America. Let's start there. I'd like to do that. I'd like to live in a country where I can just sort of go to work, raise my kids pretty much the way I want to, not have to hear lectures from self-righteous dumb people who hate me every day, not feel like every power center in American life has, its muzzle trained on me. And that's very much the experience of living here right now. If you disagree with the dogma, and of course I do. So maybe these institutions, which have consumed literally, and I checked, billions of donor dollars over the years, maybe they could reorient their mission to make it possible to live in this country if you're conservative, or even moderately conservative, even traditionally liberal. How about non-crazy? Well, they're going to. They're going to. And the Republican Party is going to do exactly the same. This is not speculation. It's a statement of fact. And the reason they're going to is because people are going to make them. So Kay Cole James is not going to run the Heritage Foundation a year from now. And if she does, then conservatives deserve it. The people who Kay Cole James did not create the Heritage Foundation. They're so-called scholars, the ones who were, God knows what they're pushing, socialized medicine or whatever. Very non-traditional ideas tend to come out of these think tanks, very non-conservative ideas. These people didn't create the institution, conservatives did. Mitch McConnell didn't create the United States Senate. He didn't create the Republican Party, neither did Kevin McCarthy. Conservatives did. So it's just a matter of taking back these institutions for the people for whom they were designed and running them as they were meant to be run, which is to say, on the side of the people who pay for them, whose votes allow them to exist, right? Just on behalf of their own people, their own voters.
But
it's not hard.
Ever since Bill Buckley, and probably before him, people have been talking about how to change the institutions of college and universities and education. And his answer was, at least start by not sending in your money, not funding this thing. As you've said, it's great to send your kids to Duke, but you have to wonder what your kids are being taught before you send them money. Is there a way do you see any hope for this changing in the direction of the party and the think tanks and the conservative DC establishment changing in any way other than just the long, slow, and probably futile slog of trying to defund them?
Oh, no. Well, I would just say a couple things. One, I don't think you have to wonder what your kids are learning at Duke. You have, if they're taking liberal arts classes, for certain they are being destroyed at Duke. Duke is destroying your children. It's wrecking them. It's making them hate you. It's making them hate the country. And worst of all, it's making them hate themselves. And so we don't have to guess about that anymore. It's very obvious. The mask is off. And that is, if there's one thing I'm hopeful about, it's people understanding what's happening. When things get this radical, there's no pretending that, we're watching a national consensus unfold. No, we're watching the country held hostage by a small group of deeply unhappy lunatics who hate everyone else. And no one can deny that. The only people who can deny that are the people who are paying no attention whatsoever. But, this is an evangelical faith we're watching. This is a religious movement. These are evangelicals. It's not enough for them to take power. They have to make certain that you agree with them. And so when they do take power, and it looks like they will, they're going to force the rest of the country not simply to obey, but to mouth the lyrics, to read the catechism, to nod in their struggle sessions and say, yes, I was wrong. This is what I now believe. That's their nature. That's who they are. That's going to happen. So once it does happen, and to some extent it's already happening right now, today, this afternoon, once it does happen, nobody can kind of pretend that, things are sort of humming along, maybe not quite due north, but close enough. I mean, there's no more pretending. In a crisis, anyone who won't defend you is the enemy, period. I know Kate Cole James. I think she's a perfectly nice person. I'm not against her as a person. I'm not against Ron Johnson. I'm not against Jim Lankford, 2 United States senators who today introduced legislation to abolish Columbus Day.
Well, you have to keep up economic productivity when you give away Juneteenth, I think. Is that what their argument, right?
Their argument's immaterial.
It's insane.
Mobs of revolutionaries are trying to eliminate American history. Why are they doing that? Not because they, don't like the aesthetics of the Columbus statues. No, they're doing it because they understand that when you eliminate people's past, you get to control their future. It's a power grab.
But you sound
and
hopeful.
Anyone who doesn't understand that, and anyone who plays along, wittingly or not, is your enemy. Period. So, I mean, that's just what it is. It all becomes very clear. So, I'm happy about that because we don't have to guess. And I know Jim Lankford and I know Ron Johnson, and I like them both. I think Lankford's legitimately smart, represents maybe the most conservative state in the union. But doing something like this puts Jim Lankford, on the wrong side. The mob shows up at my house. I know for a dead certainty that Jim Lankford's not going to get out of his easy chair to save me or my family, period. And therefore, Jim Lankford is not my friend. Jim Lankford is, in this moment, my enemy. Not personally, but factually. So, I don't know. I'm really happy about that. We don't have to think, I wonder if Kate Cole James, is really on my side. Oh, no, we know because she wrote an op-ed in USA Today telling us. And we can move forward with that understanding. It's not even ideological. This is so the debates that Bill Buckley engaged in all those years were really interesting, and I followed all of them, and I always admired him, and I admire him now. But they were essentially ideological debates. This is a post-ideological moment. There's not, we're not defending. This is not a transubstantiation debate, right? Or this isn't, is the Laffer curve actually real economics? I mean, okay. This is, do you get to live here or not? And anyone who doesn't see that, once again, sorry to repeat myself, is your enemy. Anyone in a position of authority or power who doesn't see that, the only institution in American life, the only power center available to conservatives, and trust me, my strike zone for conservative is very, very wide. All the way from Angela Nagel, who's a leftist, all the way to you, who is a very kind of traditional conservative. That whole spectrum, that whole now very wide category, Matt Taibbi is in it. Glenn Greenwald is in it. I mean, these are left wingers, okay? But they dissent. Are they, are you, am I, are we going to get to live in this country? Period. And so anyway, I'm prone to long-winded answers, but my answer is I'm really happy that we now know who's on our side and who's not.
And you sound optimistic that it'll change. The organizations that have traditionally been considered and have fundraised off of being there with conservatives will change and change quickly, because, as you said, because they have to.
Oh yeah. Oh, they're absolutely going to have to. I mean, of course. I mean, in the case of the Heritage Foundation, I mean, I think Kate Cole James is a sincere person. I mean, I give everyone the benefit of the doubt, and I've always liked her just fine. But, she couldn't have made it clearer. And by the way, I did a segment on it because I was really offended. And I didn't just go after her. I went after a bunch of different, Nikki Haley and a bunch of other so-called conservative leaders who, the second the fire started, whipped around and pointed the finger at conservatives, called them racist. But the moment I did that segment, Kate Cole James denounced me within Heritage as a racist, as if, the only reason that I might disagree with her behavior is because I don't like black people. I mean, that just tells you how deep the corruption is. If the president of the Heritage Foundation has adopted the laziest, most poisonous kind of thinking, which is to reduce everything to race, then the institution itself is beyond saving. I mean, it's just like completely rotten.
But you don't advocate for starting new ones.
Is useful. The edifice is useful. Like, people who understand what we need to do need to move into the Heritage Foundation very, very soon and take it over. And I think they will.
Because you don't advocate then for, there's a lot of folks who say, oh, abandon the commanding heights of the colleges, abandon the commanding heights of the education system, and abandon the commanding heights of the think tank world, and just start again and try to defeat them. It's extremely difficult, obviously, and you don't advocate for that.
Well, I mean, look, it takes centuries to build functioning and impressive institutions, of course. I mean, they're not legacy institutions by accident. They're legacy institutions because they have a legacy. So, it's a longitudinal process. And in point of fact, I am for abandoning the universities. Most, not all, but most of them, I think, should go out of business. And I think they'd make, fantastic housing. I mean, housing prices are really high. I don't know why we shouldn't be putting, every member of MS-13 and their baby mamas in the administration buildings at Brown. And I'm not joking. I'm totally for that. But institutions that conservatives, that purport to represent and defend conservatives, like the Republican Party, like the Heritage Foundation, like AEI, and there are many others. I mean, there's no reason conservatives should abandon their own institutions. Again, the people who run those institutions didn't build them. They don't own them. I feel this way about the high school I went to, that every one of my family went to. It's moving in a direction that I disagree with. And part of me thinks, well, that's it. I'm not going to have anything to do with it. Part of me thinks the people moving in that direction don't own the school. It's passing through their hands, just as all institutions do. We intersect with them, and then our places are taken by other people. We don't have a right to destroy something we didn't build. And I would say that Jim Langford, doesn't have a right to destroy the Republican Party. And by the way, the people like that are Mike Braun. We had Mike Braun on the other night. He's a perfectly nice person. He's a senator from Indiana. He endorsed Black Lives Matter. I know plenty of people who are for Black Lives Matter. A lot of them are nice people. I'm not mad at them. I disagree. I think Black Lives Matter is poison. Okay, they have another view. That's all right. But they're not Republican senators. Their job isn't to make it possible for my children to live in this country. That is Mike Braun's job. And he's abandoned his job. He's shirked his duty. And he should be bounced out of that position. He should lose his seat over that. And if I'm still on television, I'm going to do everything I possibly can to make sure that happens. And the same for Jim Langford. The same for anybody who refuses to defend his voters in a time of crisis. Just back to what I said in the first 5 minutes. It's like dad abandoned the family, and now the family has fallen prey to the jackals. So whose fault is that? The jackals? No, it's dad's fault, because it was his job and he didn't do it.
There's a pushback against trying to get involved by a lot of folks, a lot of normal people. My friend of mine's father says that the problem with devoting a lot of time to volunteering at church is the people who have a lot of time to spend volunteering at church can be very difficult sometimes to deal with. And because of this kind of thing, conservatives have generally not done the hard work and have left it up to the activists who've taken it over. But when you're surveying this elite ruling class revolution against the impoverished and the middle class of America, what do you see as the most powerful institutions on the left? I'm not seeing anything on the right. What on the left are the powerful institutions and the driving forces of revolution that they've managed to bring up since the 30s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and to where they are today, where they run our streets?
Well, at the time, I mean, it's every institution in American life. And I'm not going to rant about how Republicans failed to keep any of these institutions in check, because I spend my whole life doing that on television, and I hate repeating myself. But
of course,
but clearly Republicans allowed all of this to happen. They focused all of their energy on tax rates. which, by the way, can be changed with a single vote. I mean, that's you know what I mean? Like if you spend your life trying to change, and I'm for lower taxes, and I'm not making an argument for higher taxes, I guess. I'm just saying, talk about misapplied energy, talk about wasted time. What they should have been doing is keeping a very close eye on the society itself and how their voters were doing, how Americans were doing, and they didn't. But if you're asking, so it's every power center in American life is arrayed on one side. Obviously, finance, tech, journalism, our mainstream religious institutions, our federal law enforcement agencies, the intelligence agencies, the Pentagon, absolutely the Pentagon. Conservatives don't want to admit that, but it's true. We've allowed for years senior officers to get promotion credit by going to Princeton. Really? Why? I mean, what do you think that's about? You know, that's as captured an institution as we have. Why do you think we're still in Afghanistan? Why do you think we bombed Syria twice? You know, these are ideologues, and they're part of the blob. So, but if I were to create a hierarchy of power, obviously the capstone in that pyramid would be Google. You know, it's the most powerful company in the history of the world. Its power far outstrips that of the U.S. government because it controls all human information in English. And once you control the terms, you control the outcome. If you control the information, if you control the words themselves, then there's really nothing you don't control. And they do. Their search engine, the Google search engine, is the portal through which more than 90% of all human information in English flows. So there's nothing that compares to that. There's never been a company that powerful. There's never been a company close to as powerful. I mean, William Randolph Hearst owned, I don't know, a dozen newspapers, and he was considered a threat to democracy because it was too much power concentrated in the hands of one man. He was conservative, so that's why people were so alarmed. But magnify that influence times infinity, and you approach where Google is now. Now, it's a little late to be grousing about what we should have done, but clearly we should have. The U.S. government's legitimacy is imperiled by Google. You can't have an institution in your country that's more powerful than the government, right? Or else you cease to be, in any meaningful sense, a democracy. And yet we've allowed Google to grow into that, abetted, by the way, by the U.S. Congress, as you know. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I think it'd be very difficult for Trump to win an election with Google weighing in. I think it's very difficult for the Congress to function as intended, and I think it's very difficult for people who don't agree with Google to have a voice, as long as Google is what it is.
And it's not exactly the kind of institution that can be replicated on the right. It's
right. I mean, this is like I can't even engage in this debate, and this just shows you how bankrupt conservative institutions have become. That you get this lecture about competition, it's not a monopoly, and it's like the Senator Mike Lee of Utah, a very smart guy, and I have no doubt a decent person, but utterly intellectually corrupt. I mean, utterly. But giving you this lecture about how this is how markets work. Well, there's no intersection between monopolies and markets. Monopolies make markets impossible. I mean, by definition, and Google is a monopoly. And no, of course, you can't start your own Google, and it's insulting to suggest something like that. I've been sitting here. I don't like politicians. I never have. I know them all. I don't admire any of them. Maybe the only politician I admire, other than George Washington, is Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt understood this, and Teddy Roosevelt saved capitalism, made the middle class possible by reining in the power of the group we call the robber barons. And watching New York decide to tear a statue down because racism somehow, I've been so struck by how few conservatives have marched to the podium to defend Teddy Roosevelt. And then I remembered, oh, of course, they hate Teddy Roosevelt, the most popular president in American history, because he questioned the monopoly. And they're all actually monopolists. They are. They're not market people. If they were in favor of free markets, they'd be horrified by our tech sector, so many of which operate with effective monopolies. I mean, 90% of all digital news is effectively controlled by Google and Facebook because they control digital advertising.
I've lived it.
That's not a market. You've lived it. I have too. Consider the effect of that. If all your news organizations are controlled by two companies, anyway, that's not a market. That's Orwellian. That's a nightmare. And they've said nothing about it. So, I mean, I could pile on for hours about how unimpressive and how derelict conservatives have been, and I'll stop. But I just want to reiterate, this will change. These people have failed. We had an acid test, and they were proved to be, counterfeit, and they will be replaced.
You had a great piece in Politico magazine years ago when Donald Trump was running for president, where you compared him favorably with Teddy Roosevelt, saying that the American people don't appreciate a mob outside the mansion screaming that they want everything that's inside. But they do appreciate somebody inside the mansion taking a chair and throwing it to the window and saying this entire house is corrupt. And that's what Teddy Roosevelt was, and that's what you hoped Donald Trump would do as a traitor to his elite class. He's actually begun to move in that direction in the past week, I think in no small part because of you, and to try to crack down and to bring in Bill Barr and bring in the implements of the United States as much as he can. Is the president actually able to have in real life, not should he, but is he able to have an impact on this when he's got a military that apologizes for him when he threatens to use them, and a House and a Senate that are largely silent when Tom Cotton goes out and writes an op-ed in the New York Times? Republicans don't rush out to defend him when he's stricken from their pages and they apologize. Are people like Trump and Cotton alone? Or are the institutions of power so arrayed against them that they can't even, they're essentially neutered in their positions?
No, they're not neutered. Of course they have power. They have less power than they ought to have. In the case of the president, that's his fault. You get what you put up with. If, you let your kids roll a joint at the breakfast table, the next thing they're shooting heroin at lunch. Like, of course, they're your kids. It's his administration. These are his generals. This is his FBI. This is his CIA. And if you spend 4 years letting them give you the finger, you shouldn't be surprised when they burn your house down. So you get what you put up with. You can't put up with that shit, not for 1 second. That's my view. So, but whatever. But here we are. Of course, he retains power. He's the president of the United States. And simply saying out loud why this is bad is helpful. He's doing that. I'm grateful. I think a lot of people are. But you also have the Department of Justice, the most powerful, law enforcement agency in the world, the FBI, under you. You run the FBI. It's part of the executive branch. You're the president. So how hard can it be to arrest the perpetrators, since the perpetrators are all on video? All of it is knowable. All of it is provable. It was filmed. There's never been a revolution televised like this one has been. So sure, of course, you can bring them to justice. There's pushback. I hear about it all the time. Well, nobody wants to do that. Well, okay, tough. This is what we're doing, period. Like now.
The voters want it.
And yeah, of course the voters want it. And if you want to know why, Trump has lost 10 points in the past month, it's really simple. Riots and revolution, upheaval like this, cruelty, we're seeing that on a mass scale, makes people's lives worse. I don't think he should send the 82nd Airborne into Atlanta. I'm not saying that. It's enough to arrest people. It's enough to use the system. By the way, if you don't use the system collapses. This is an attack on our system, particularly on our justice system. the basic idea behind our justice system is that we're all equal under the law, period. The law does not take into account who your parents were, what color you are. We haven't always lived up to that, needless to say, but that's the point of it. I mean, that's why our justice system is different. And Black Lives Matter and Antifa, and there are many enablers in the media and the Congress, are trying to change that and replace it with a system that takes a lot of account of who your parents were and what you look like and what your race is. And so if you want to stop that from happening, and I think we do, because that would make America a country you don't want to live in, then you use your system already in place for 240 years to stop it. And in doing that, you establish its legitimacy, right? In other words, when people see the leaders of Antifa in shackles, they will know the system is defending itself and defending us from people who are seeking to overthrow it. If they don't see that, if this stuff goes on unchallenged, then people begin to wonder, why should I support this system? It's impotent. It doesn't work. It's old. You know what I mean? It's sort of like if you have a relative who you really respect, the second that person begins to show signs of senility, you love him every bit as much, but you don't seek his advice anymore. You can't help it. You respect him less, right? I'm not saying you leave him on an ice floe, but it's just that's human nature. We respect the strong. We have contempt for the weak. We're animals. You know, if you have two dogs and one of them is very sick, you don't leave the dogs together because the healthy one will kill the sick one. That's a dog's instinct, kill the weak. And there's a little bit of that in all of us. And if we forget that, then we make unwise decisions. And the unwise decision that our leaders have made is imagining that by accommodating the revolution will abate. And, you know, that's not true. It's the opposite of what's true. And it suggests that they don't really understand people very well.
At least Jeff Bezos realizes that the best way to survive is to be at the front of the revolution. About 20 years ago.
I do think, there's something going on there. Jeff Bezos, online, as a factual matter, as a matter of news, there are a lot of e-commerce businesses that are very vulnerable to social media pressure. Of course, if you exist only online and you feel you're being targeted by organized groups of people online, then you will bow to their will. That all makes sense. You've got a lot at stake. Jeff Bezos has nothing at stake. Jeff Bezos is literally the richest man in the history of the world. Probably nothing Jeff Bezos could probably do anything and would still die as the richest person in the world. So why is he doing this? And I think there are a bunch of different reasons. It's a complex answer, and I don't fully understand. Part of it is, destroying independent business increases his market share. COVID and the riots have destroyed countless independent businesses. So it's good for the bottom line for Jeff Bezos, but it's deeper than that, clearly. And I think it has to do with the guilt that affluent Americans feel about the changes in our economy that basically have rewarded smart people and screwed everybody else. And that's why we have this really dramatic income inequality, which, I wrote a whole book on this, predicting we were going to get a revolution, and okay, it happened. And I'm hardly a genius. It was just so obvious. What we're looking at is a revolution driven by economic anxiety and frustration over the way the fruits of our economy are distributed. That's what's really happening. I wish people would just say it. Anyway, whatever. So Jeff Bezos, I think, feels bad about it. Well, I do. I think guilt and self-hatred clearly play a role in our elite's participation in this.
So the tools exist, as you say, but 20 years ago, Pat Buchanan was complaining about this when the NAACP attacked Bush's cabinet appointees as Taliban wing and extreme right and devoted to the Confederacy. And he was sitting there longing for the moral certitude of, say, the anti-religious right Democratic Party, saying that he said that a conservative party that believed in itself would have had the IRS look into the NAACP to make sure that partisan attacks weren't a violation of its tax status, to cut off discretionary federal funds until the chairman was fired, to ask major corporations and donors if they stood by these kind of attacks on the president, to amend the tax laws to go after organizations like Ford. But instead, they wrote a letter saying this was disappointing and asked to meet. Of course, they were turned down. This is a long-standing problem, and do you see that kind of return to the certainty and the fighting faith after this rebellion, after we've reached rock bottom? The conservatives who realize, and as you say, anyone who thinks the founding of this country is good, this is an inherently just and free society that is worth defending. Anyone, conservative, liberal, this might reinvigorate that spirit to stand up and fight with moral certitude again.
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, one thing we do know is that crisis, high levels of stress, change people. So you're not the same after it happens. And I'm sure you could go through your own life and think of the moments where something really stressful occurred in your life. And then, 2 years later, you're really not the same person. So we know that things will be very, very different after this. The question is how? And look, I mean, let's be honest. What you're seeing is the people in charge trying to foment a kind of race war. That's the left doing this, attacking people for their skin color, really attacking them in ways that are dangerous, that suggest, we want to really hurt you physically. And they're saying that because of how you were born. So there's really nothing more threatening than that. What's the effect going to be? Well, if they keep it, I keep thinking that they clearly want to create really radical race politics, because you wouldn't do this unless you wanted to create really radical race politics, because by doing it, you are going to create radical race politics. And by radical race politics, I mean politics in which people identify first and foremost by their skin color. I am this party because I am this color. You don't want, I cannot be emphatic enough. I don't want to live in that country because it doesn't end well. It never ends well.
Sounds like South Africa.
People don't actually coexist peacefully under those terms. One side has to vanquish the other, and that suggests violence, and that's why there is violence when you have tribalism. So I don't want that. I think it's bad. But if they don't stop right now, we're going to get that. Because how could we not get it? They're saying you're required to think of yourself first and foremost as a person who possesses your skin color. That's the most important thing about you, what color you are. They're like crazed, wild-eyed racists, obviously. And if you keep telling people that, and you tell their children that, after a while, they will begin to think about themselves primarily as who they are racially. And so anyway, God knows what happens when that starts. I mean, seriously. But I could have a lot to say about it, but I'll stop there. I think the only answer at this point, and I keep saying this on TV, no one else seems to say it along with me, but the only answer is to fall back on our fundamental defense, which is the country itself, its customs, its founding documents. We should, as non-revolutionaries, say out loud every day, we want this to be a colorblind meritocracy. A colorblind meritocracy where you're not judged in the eyes of the law for how you look or who your parents were, but on what you do.
You laid this out last night.
No accommodations whatsoever. If you want to live in a just society, a non-racist, everyone's pushing, I want to live in a non-racist society. Okay, what does that look like? A non-racist society is a society in which you are not judged for your race, by definition. So let's stop judging people. Period.
Our newest monument in the National Mall is Martin Luther King, who gave that famous speech at the Lincoln Monument. But on Tuesday night, you outlined a Republican platform that you think is something that they need to stand for, something very positive. and to break it down more quickly than you did, or more succinctly, I guess, would be a vigorous defense of total equality, like you just spoke about, a defense of freedom of speech, vigorous, unending defense of freedom of speech, and a middle class at the core, not rich corporations and not simply pandering to the working poor, but a middle class which forms a strong America. So when are you going to run on that platform?
Well, I'm not running on anything. I mean, I would be assassinated if I ran, not by Democrats, but by my daughters, who are basically nonviolent. But, you know, no, I'm a talk show host. That's my job. It's what I enjoy doing. It's what I've always done. So I'm going to keep doing that. But I do think we've gotten to a place where people just accept that we live in a society where your kids aren't going to get certain jobs or get into certain schools because of their skin color. And I feel like saying to the whole country, people of all colors, listen to yourselves. Listen to what you're saying. That's grotesque. Slavery and segregation were immoral because they judged people for the color of their skin. And yet we're all accepting and participating in a system where that's the rule. And why are we doing that? And why are conservatives going along with it? And boy, are they. I can't remember the last time I heard a conservative say, no, your race should have no role in whether you're hired. It should have no role in whether you get into college, which we, I guess, still accept is the ladder to success. Like, why really? Why are we accepting that? It's totally immoral. And so I hope people will say that. Yeah, I want to live in a non-racist society. But in order to do that, you have to try. And trying means moving race from its position of primacy back out to the periphery where it belongs. You know, this guy's an amazing engineer. He happens to be Filipino or whatever. I don't care. That's the country you want to live in. You don't want to live in a country that says, I need 3 Filipino engineers. That's insane. You know, that's apartheid South Africa. That's, you know what I mean? Tuscaloosa, 1950. Like, you don't want that. Why do we want that? I don't want that, and I'll never accept that. And I don't care what name they call me. I will never accept that. I think it's wrong. And by the way, and I will say one more time, if we keep this crap up, I'm telling you, we're going to have a very ugly political landscape. I mean, and I mean it too, because some people are going to say, you know what, screw it. Yeah, you want me to think of myself in terms of my skin color? Now I do. And all people who look like me need to come together and we're going to pick up arms or what, you know, God knows where it could go. Don't do this. They're so reckless, the people doing this. They're children. They should have no access to the levers of power.
Well, Tucker, you've got a show to get to, so I won't keep you much longer. Have a happy July 4th. I hope you get to spend it relaxed away from this with the rest of the country on a weekend with family and friends, remembering the reason why we're proud and the things that we're fighting for.
I will be waist deep in a trout stream. It is, fortunately, it's getting toward dry fly season here in Maine, so I will be throwing large mayfly imitations at hungry brook trout. Say a prayer.
I will for them and for you, and hopefully at least dinner with the family.
Amen. This
has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. You can follow us on social media at Federalist, and until next time, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.